A group of researchers stood before a majestic portal that trembled in the air like a living being. Its surface shimmered with an ominous black and silver glow that seemed cold even to the touch. The expedition captain, Dr. Mark Walters, silently looked at this strange creation of science and unknown forces. His heart pounded in his chest, as if warning of danger, but Mark muffled this voice of reason. "Ready?" he asked, looking around at his team. His voice sounded firm, but his eyes hid anxiety. Biologist Susan Carter nervously adjusted her backpack. Her hands trembled, and her fingers clenched the straps. "Ready as ever," she replied, but her smile looked forced. Physicist Henry Lawson carefully checked the equipment. "The sensors show the structure is stable," he muttered, his gaze occasionally drifting to the portal. "It's just energy. Just another dimension, another world," he seemed to be trying to convince himself, but his voice was breaking. As the team, one by one, began to step through the shimmering curtain, each of them felt reality shift. Mark was the first, and what he saw made him freeze. This was Earth, but not as they had known it. The forest spread out before them, thick and dark, the trees reaching for the sky like giant arms reaching for the light. But the sky was alien, an unnatural purple, like an eternal sunset, but devoid of warmth. "God, this is amazing," Susan whispered, approaching Mark. But her voice was shaking, not with admiration. The air was thick and heavy, filled with a sweet, putrid smell. The smell made you want to turn away, but it was everywhere. The silence of the world was eerie. No birds, no insects. Only a dull, indistinct hum that seemed to come from everywhere. It was a sound that penetrated your very soul, making your heart clench with fear. Daniel Rhodes, the engineer, took a few steps forward, raising his scanner. "Something's wrong. Nothing's right here," he said hoarsely. The screen of his device showed only chaotic signals, like a chaotic whisper. "It's just differences in the energy field," Henry tried to reassure him, but he himself couldn't take his eyes off the trees, whose trunks were covered with strange patterns that looked like ancient runes. Alex Harris, the medic, stopped, pressing his hand to his chest. "Do you feel it?" "It feels like something is pressing on your heart," he said. His voice was shaky, his eyes darting around, searching for an explanation. Mark, feeling his own fears grow, decided to act. "Stay together. We're here to investigate, not to panic," he commanded sharply, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. As they walked deeper into the forest, the team noticed that the ground beneath their feet was soft, as if filled with liquid. The leaves they trampled seemed to emit a faint blue glow. "It's like organic material," Susan whispered, bending down to touch one of the leaves. As her fingers touched the surface, the leaf suddenly trembled and slowly curled up, as if responding to the touch. Susan jumped back, gasping for breath. "It's a living plant. No more. This is something else," she whispered. "Maybe we're not alone," Daniel muttered, staring into the dark gaps between the trees. Everyone froze, listening to every sound. Their confidence was fading with each passing minute. Each of them felt their primary interest giving way to a sense of threat. The air seemed to be filled with an invisible force that was pulling them toward it, squeezing their chests and making each step seem weighty. "We have to keep going, or we'll learn nothing," Mark said, but even he knew that this world didn't want to share its secrets. They moved forward, each step on the ground a heavy blow in their chests. The trees, which had seemed silent, seemed to be watching them with their twisted branches. It felt like this world was alive, and he was watching. The dense forest gradually drew the team into its eerie embrace. The world beyond the portal seemed infinitely alien, as if it had been created not by nature, but by something much darker and more sinister. Each step deeper was heavy, and it seemed that the air pressure itself was getting stronger, squeezing their chests, as if this world did not want to see them here. The shadows between the giant tree trunks moved, creating the illusion that someone was watching them. The branches overhead, covered in strange knots and patterns, resembled nerve endings that whispered among themselves, although there was no wind. Suddenly, a sound cut through the air, not loud, but one that pierced to the bone. It was a low, grinding sound, as if someone was cutting metal against stone. The sound spread in distant echoes, and everyone stopped, frozen in place. "What is this?" Susan whispered, covering her mouth with her hand, as if afraid that her voice would wake something sleeping in the darkness. Mark raised his hand, gesturing for silence. "Keep up, stay close," he said, but his voice sounded tense, and his gaze was also fixed on the unknown source of the sound. Henry pulled out his scanner, but the device began to display chaotic signals. "This is impossible," he muttered, looking at the screen. "This noise is not an echo." It's like he stopped, never saying what he meant. The forest grew denser, and the light from the crimson sky faded, as if during an approaching thunderstorm. The trees here were even stranger. Their branches formed twisted spirals that resembled distorted hands. On the ground between the roots of the trees, some strange, barely visible creatures, looking like a mixture of insects and plants, were teeming. They disappeared at the slightest movement of the explorers, leaving behind wet traces that shimmered in the twilight. "This place, it lives," Daniel breathed, clutching the metal probe in his hand. His voice trembled, and it was clear that the thought did not give him peace. Suddenly Alex stopped, pressing his fingers to his temple. I hear something," he said, staring intently into the darkness. "What do you hear?" Mark asked, trying to remain calm, but his own heart was beating like crazy. "Voices," Alex answered, his eyes wide open. "Whispers. They seem to be talking, but I can't make out the words." Meanwhile, Susan crouched down near one of the trees, intrigued by its strange roots, which seemed to pulse with a faint light. She reached out to touch them, but something suddenly flashed to the side. In the darkness, a few meters away, eyes seemed to appear. "There's someone," she shouted, jumping back. Her scream echoed through the forest, but Mark immediately ordered, "Hold your position. Don't run." The light from the team's flashlights swirled in different directions, revealing only the bizarre shapes of trees and wet trunks. The eyes disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, but the feeling of being watched was now almost physical. Each of their hearts was pounding in their chests, and their hands were damp with sweat. Daniel checked their weapons again, the simple stun gun they had taken, just in case. Now the device seemed like a meager consolation. "It's paranoia," Henry tried to reassure himself, but his words sounded unconvincing. Susan held closer to Alex, her eyes darting around. "This world, it's alive, and it doesn't want us. It could just be a defensive reaction. We have to stay rational," Mark insisted, but even he could feel his confidence crumbling under the pressure of this unknown. Chapter resolution. The team moved on, but each step seemed harder for them. The sounds of the forest grew more intense, a crunch, a whisper, a wheezing that they couldn't explain. And just when they were beginning to hope that danger was behind them, the same sound reappeared, the crunch of metal, much closer now. "It's moving," Alex whispered, clutching the portable scanner in his hands. And at that moment, from the darkness, a few meters away, a new sound came from them, a hoarse breath, like a death rattle. Their flashlights simultaneously pointed in the direction of the noise, and what they saw made them freeze in horror. The light of their lanterns cut through the thick darkness, revealing the trembling outlines of giant trees and the damp earth covered with a black slime. What they saw at first seemed only part of the alien nature of this world. From among the roots emerged something that resembled a collection of distorted limbs. The creature slowly grew out of the ground, its body as if poured from resin, dripping with a thick black liquid. Eyes, like shiny obsidian stones, seemed to burn from within. Its form was incomplete, as if it had just emerged from the darkest corners of the horrors of their subconscious. Mark automatically stepped forward, raising a hand to stop the others. His breathing became ragged, and shock was written on his face. "Back! We're retreating," he said in a hoarse voice, but his feet seemed to be rooted to the ground. Susan covered her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming, but her eyes were wide open, tears of panic glistening in them. Alex slowly backed away, holding the scanner in his hand, which emitted a wild squeal, signaling an unspeakable threat. "This can't be real," Henry whispered, but his voice broke. Everyone felt fear begin to penetrate them on a physical level. Hearts were beating so loudly that it seemed they could be heard even from a distance. Even the simple movement of the flashlight seemed an insurmountable task. Daniel, who usually kept his composure, now stood as if paralyzed, clutching his weapon. His fingers trembled, his eyes frantically searching for an explanation for this horror. Is this some kind of reflection? Are we even still alive? He muttered. We're on foreign soil. We need to move on, Mark said, summoning the last of his courage. However, his voice could not hide the fact that he himself did not fully believe what he was saying. The world around comes to life. The creature made a movement that was more like a slide. Its body made a sound like a rubber mass stretching. The ground beneath its feet opened up as if swallowing it, leaving behind black traces that shimmered dimly. A strange rustling arose in the forest, which could not be explained by the wind. There was none. The branches of the trees began to move, although none of the team saw that any force was touching them. It seemed that the world itself was coming to life, reacting to the aliens. Something cracked under Susan's feet, and she jumped instinctively. What was that? She exclaimed, trying not to lose her balance. Looking down, she saw that she had shattered some unknown crystal. It shattered, and a thin, vapor-like stream escaped from it, which immediately disappeared into thin air. It's a trap. This whole world is a trap, Henry said, kneeling down to get a better look at the fragments. But no one dared to approach it. The creature did not move anymore. It froze, as if studying its guests. Its gaze, if it could be called a gaze, was so piercing that everyone felt naked before its unknown essence. What should we do? Susan asked, her voice breaking into tears. We can't run, Mark replied, trying to speak firmly. But even he understood that it was only self-defense, a lie meant to reassure them. Suddenly, Alex took a step forward, aiming his scanner at the creature. I have to check this out. If we don't figure out what we're dealing with, we're all going to die. Alex, no! Susan shouted, but it was too late. He took a few steps closer, his flashlight illuminating the creature's face, if you could call it that. The creature suddenly moved forward, but without attacking. Its body began to dissolve into thin air, leaving behind only a thick black vapor that spread across the ground like fog. It gave off a scent that was both dizzying and acutely alarming. Alex stopped, his eyes glassy. He whispered, "It hasn't gone. It's here." And at that moment, the team realized. The threat hadn't gone away. It had become part of their surroundings, absorbed into the air, into the ground, and was now inexorably approaching them. The team moved forward, leaving behind them the place where they had first seen the creature. It seemed that it was no longer pursuing them, but the feeling of its presence did not disappear. The air became thick and heavy, as if permeated with something invisible but threatening. It seemed that even their own breath pressed against their chests. The forest around them grew darker and darker. The trees seemed to grow upwards, blocking out any glimpse of the sky. Their trunks looked twisted, as if they were being embraced or strangled by invisible hands. Deep scratches could be seen on the bark of some of the trees, like the marks of large claws. Underfoot, the ground felt more like a damp sponge. With each step, it made a muffled sloshing sound, as if the team were trampling through mud, but there was no water to be seen anywhere. The darkness swallowed up the light of the lanterns, and even the stronger rays that emanated from them could not pierce this curtain. At first it was only a soft whisper. Perhaps the wind, but there was no wind. The sounds were dull and vague, as if someone was talking through a thick layer of fabric. "Do you hear that?" Susan whispered, turning to the others. Mark nodded, but did not say a word. His hand trembled as he held the lantern, and the light from it jumped along the tree trunks, creating eerie shadows. The voices became clearer. They were strangely deep, but you could make out the notes of a whisper in them. Henry stopped and clenched his hands into fists. "It's just our imaginations. We're tired. It's just the wind." But even he didn't believe what he was saying. His voice was broken, and his eyes darted about, as if searching for something that didn't exist. Alex stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on the ground. There was something here, he said. There was barely contained panic in his voice. He leaned down to get a better look at the mark in the ground. It was a deep hole, like the imprint of a large paw with claws digging into the ground. Susan screamed as a black, tar-like liquid suddenly began to pour from the trees. It flowed down thickly, as if the tree was bleeding. Her scream was so sharp that Alex rushed to her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and turned her back to him with force. "Calm down. We have to stick together." Now the whisper turned into something louder. They were separate words, spoken in a strange, non-human language, but its sound made her heart clench with cold. The voices seemed to be coming from everywhere, from behind the trees, underground, even from within their own heads. "We need to move," Mark shouted, trying to block out the noise. But his words were drowned out by a new sound, a sound like the muffled beating of a drum, rhythmic and constant. It was getting closer and closer. "They can see us," Susan said quietly, her voice breaking. "This place, it's not just alive. It's watching us." Her words brought a cold sweat to everyone's ears. The feeling of being followed was so strong that everyone, without consulting, began to look over their shoulders. But there was no movement anywhere. Alex held his scanner in front of him. It was flashing red, showing that the source of the unknown energy was very close. But this time he didn't speak. His face was frozen in a mask of anxiety, and his eyes were beginning to fill with tears. The drum beat abruptly stopped. Everything around them froze in an eerie silence that pressed against their ears. And it was at this moment that they heard the most terrible thing, a voice that clearly said, "Aliens." It was a word that everyone understood, but it sounded as if it had been uttered by someone who had just learned the human language. It was so unnatural that everyone felt a chill run down their spines. They stood still because they could no longer move. Everyone understood. What had begun as a normal expedition had become something much worse. They were no longer explorers. They had become prey. The team kept moving, though each step was becoming more and more difficult. It seemed as if the forest itself was trying to hold them back. Branches clung to their clothes. Tree roots pushed out of the ground, forming dangerous traps. The air had become almost unbreathable. It was thick, musty, with a faint smell of rot, as if the very life of this place was rotting from within. Susan could not help but tremble. Her hands, tightly clenched on the straps of her backpack, could hardly feel anything except a tingling sensation. She kept looking ahead, afraid to look back over her shoulder. She knew there was something behind them. Not just voices, not just shadows. This something was alive. Her heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. Henry, who was walking ahead, stopped every now and then, wiping sweat from his forehead. His eyes scanned the landscape, searching for any way to safety. But safety was an illusion. He gritted his teeth angrily. "If we don't find a way out, we won't be here." Alex held the scanner in his hands, but it was now completely useless. The red indicators flickered, as if signaling something unknown, but this only increased his panic. "Energy. There's too much energy here," he whispered, but his words were lost in the sounds. The light from the lanterns began to flicker. The first time it had happened a few minutes ago, but now the interruptions had become so frequent that the darkness had almost swallowed them up completely. Suddenly, silhouettes appeared from the depths of the forest. They were not just shadows. Their shapes were distorted, as if created from smoke, but in the center of each were two bright holes of light that resembled eyes. "What is this?" Mark's voice broke with fear. Susan gasped, her hands clutching Henry, but he didn't move. He froze, like a rabbit that has seen a predator. One of these creatures approached. Its face was at once human and indistinct, as if someone had distorted human features beyond recognition. It didn't move, but a voice came from within it. "You shouldn't have come here." The words made everyone shudder. It wasn't a threat, but a sentence. Alex tried to take a step back, but he tripped and fell. His flashlight flew out of his hands and rolled towards the creature, which lowered its head for a moment, as if studying him. "Let's run," Henry finally came to life and grabbed Susan's hand. They began to run, not knowing where they were going. The forest had become a maze, each tree looking like another, and the paths seemed to meander. Behind them came a sound like the grinding of metal on stone. It pursued them, growing louder, almost unbearable. "It's coming!" Susan shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the general chaos. Alex stood up, his hands shaking, but he ran after the others. "They won't stop!" he shouted, but his words only increased the panic. The team kept running until suddenly an open clearing appeared before them. In its center stood a stone with symbols carved into it, glowing with a dim red light. But that wasn't the scariest part. Behind the stone stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long arms that reached down to the ground. Her head was tilted to the side, and her eyes glowed with a white, empty light. "It's waiting for us," Mark said softly, and his voice faded into silence. Now the team was faced with a choice: continue to flee or face this unknown face to face. But one thing was clear: they would not survive without a fight. The stone in the center of the clearing emitted an ominous red glow that broke the dim light of the lanterns. The symbols carved on its surface seemed alive. They seemed to pulse, changing shape, and each new figure was more bizarre than the last. There was a sinister harmony in their chaotic dynamics that attracted the eye like a magnet. Susan took a step forward, not noticing how her hands slowly reached for the stone. Her eyes became glassy, as if her mind had fallen into a trap. "Don't touch!" Henry grabbed her shoulder sharply and pulled her back. His voice was hoarse, his face wet with sweat. Susan started, as if awakened from a terrible dream, and when she saw the red light reflected in her eyes, she screamed. Her scream pierced the darkness like glass flying to pieces. The forest seemed to respond. The leaves rustled, and from the depths came low, monotonous whispers. They sounded as if hundreds of voices were simultaneously speaking incomprehensible words. "They know we're here," Alex said in a trembling voice, his eyes fixed on the stone. His face had lost its color, and his hands clutched the scanner, which now simply beeped in short, intermittent signals. Mark decided to examine the stone more closely, although his heart was pounding in his chest, as if warning him of danger. It's some kind of language," he said, swallowing a lump in his throat. His voice sounded muffled, as if he was afraid that the words would be heard. The stone suddenly glowed brighter, and one of the symbols began to stand out. Its outlines glowed with blue light, then burst from the surface of the stone like flames. The symbol hung in the air before Mark, who froze, gripped by terror and fascination. "It's looking at me," he whispered, unable to look away. The rest of the team stood silently, watching as the symbol began to rotate, emitting a faint humming sound. Suddenly, a blue light exploded around the stone, and all the team members fell to their knees, as if their burden had become unbearable. Each heard something different. Henry heard the voice of his long-dead mother and felt her accusatory tone. Susan heard the laughter of children, but it quickly turned into shrill cries. Alex heard the clang of metal and chains, writhing like snakes. "Stop it!" Henry shouted, pressing his hands to his ears. But the sound was not from outside, but from within. Out of the darkness, the same shadows that had pursued them in the forest reappeared. But now they were clearer. Their faces were split into two halves that revolved around each other. Their eyes shone with a pale light that carried cold and hopelessness. "You can't come back," one of them said in a voice that was both human and horribly alien. Susan shuddered, clutching her head in her hands. "What do you want?" But the only answer was a new surge of whispers that rose and fell like waves crashing against a rock. Henry summoned all his strength, grabbed Susan by the hand, and forced her to her feet. "We can't stay here." He looked at Mark, who seemed to be in a trance. Alex grabbed him by the shoulders and began to shake him. "Wake up! We have to go!" Mark finally reacted, but his eyes were empty. He just nodded and slowly backed away from the stone, which continued to pulse with red light. The stone suddenly emitted a red glow that swept through the forest like a shockwave. The shadows disappeared, but their whispers remained. Alex's scanner showed frantic energy readings. "This isn't over," he whispered. The team gathered and began to move on, although each of them felt that a part of their soul remained near the stone. The darkness grew even thicker, and the forest even more hostile. They understood that the stone was only the beginning, and something much worse awaited them ahead. Everyone felt the weight of their fear, but no one dared to speak. Their hearts clenched with the foreboding that the world they had entered would not let them go without a fight.